get enough questions of exactly the same variety, then I need to answer them. Sometimes, since I made a ton of videos, things are spread out. What did I say, didn't I say? I'm going to make this really pithy, which sometimes I'm not very pithy. Often I'm not very pithy, right? I said that on the Fuji X-T2 that the buffer is not, of course, on par, even with a vertical grip and even in boost mode. I mean, let's face it, I've got the fastest SD cards in here money can buy, but these are SD cards. They are not XQD cards, as in the Nikon D500. Here's a couple of Nikon D500s. Although, of course, it's rocking an SD card slot, too, in the Nikon D500. So, that's not the case. Is it any less of a camera for sports action, wildlife? I'll answer that. That's actually a two-part answer. The first part of that answer is no. I mean, the autofocus tracking, here's what I did say. The autofocus tracking on the Fuji X-T2, and this is not fanboy talk. Some people have actually said, oh, well, he's just really enthusiastic about a new toy. I don't work like that. I know a lot of people say, oh my god, it's great, it's awesome, and then they find out later, well, something about it really sucks. I don't work that way. What I said specifically, and I mean this, and I've been testing the camera now for 3 days. I've been pounding it into the dirt. The autofocus tracking on the Fuji X-T2 blasts the hell out of the Nikon D500, okay? Blasts it, burns it, smokes it, okay? Great. But part of shooting is 3 different things. The buffer, the low light autofocus acquisition, and obviously the autofocus tracking. And autofocus tracking varies depending on the type of lens it's used, also whether you have there's another person out there that I know for a fact. There's another Fuji X-T2 video out there, and everybody keeps pointing it to me. It's like some dude with red hair and a beard. I know for a fact. He's saying when he's actually tracking cars going by that it's losing autofocus after it's passed. And he doesn't have his camera set properly. He just got it. I've had it now for 3 days. I know what he's doing wrong. So, you know, he's not purposely misleading you, but he's just not using the camera correctly. So yes, the autofocus tracking does blast the D500. Low light autofocus tracking, I said, acquisition, low light autofocus, back and forth, back and forth. Basically the same. On par with the same, okay? So let me repeat that and then hit the major point here at the very end very quickly. The buffer is not on par with the D500, even with, the buffer is amazing on the Fuji X-T2. Perfectly fine for sports and action. But, you know, they're SD cards, they're not XQD cards. The XQD cards are ha 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 ha. Yes, they're enormous. The low light autofocus acquisition is on par with the autofocus tracking on the X-T2. Blasts the D500, it just burns it into the dirt, okay? Now there are 2 parts of autofocus tracking here. And that's something that has to be said, obviously. Fuji's got plenty of lenses, but ain't nobody touching Nikon's big lenses. So the question is somebody going to be like dropping their Nikon D5 or their D500 with like a 300mm 2.8 AFS lens, or 500mm 600mm, or 70 to 200 2.8, which Fuji does have their own version of the 70 to 200 2.8, the 50 to 140. And I've been using it on the X-T2. It's blasting fast. But in general, are the dudes on the sidelines of sports, like, let's say, for example, one of the best lenses ever, which has got like almost 5 stops of image stabilization, which is the Nikkor 200 to 500mm. No, nobody's going to be dropping the Nikkor 200 to 500mm on the Nikon D500 or the D5 for the Fuji. Okay? So yes, while the autofocus tracking on the X-T2 does blast the Nikon, you know, if someone has a 200 to 500 on their Nikkor on the sidelines of a sports action, they're making money, they're doing that, no, of course they're not going to go like, well, you know, I'm going to drop the Nikon. The glass does not exist yet for the Fuji. Not in that arena. So you have to take that into consideration. We have to talk about the buffer, the low light autofocus acquisition, the actual autofocus tracking itself. But I could have the insane autofocus tracking, which I do on the X-T2, but I don't have those crazy-ass lenses that Nikon's been rolling out now for decades and decades. And certainly not something like the 200 to 500mm Nikkor. I mean, that lens is, oh. So no, you know, the lens does not exist for the Fuji. You can mount it on the Fuji, but it'll be manual focus, so considerations, you know, plus, minus, you know, have to be fair, have to be reasonable, have to be logical in making these statements. So that is what I said, and that isn't what I said. This video is basically a summation of what I said over 20-some videos, and that is that. Okay, bye.